Dobry wieczór. The rest of the lecture will be in English, I'm afraid. I'm sorry about that. Okay, so I know it's late. I know there's a lack of oxygen in the room, and unfortunately for you, I have another 80 slides before we let you go, which works out to be about 15 seconds a slide. So I'm sorry, I'll just have to keep your attention level. I'd like to thank you to begin with for us being here, me and my wife, who will speak tomorrow as well. What I want to do here today is present the case for doing much more of the kind of project that we just saw. We have had an amazing experience and education just in the few days that we've been here, looking at the architecture that is at risk in this area and in the city of Split as well. I'll touch on that a little bit. But what I want to do today is present the case for buildings that nobody loves. And just because somebody doesn't love the building does not necessarily mean that it has no reason to continue existing. What I'm talking about is perhaps the environmental, the social, or even the business case of existing buildings, and how they can be reframed, maybe on even a global context, to see the value where people are not seeing value in these buildings today. What I'm talking specifically about is the concept of what we call adaptive transformation, or some people call adaptive reuse. And it goes beyond simply the question of renovation. There's a morphological aspect and there's a programmatic aspect. The morphological is where you start to change the form of the building. The programmatic aspect is the idea that a building that is purpose-built for one use at a particular historical period may lose its relevance for that purpose, but nevertheless be able to be converted for other uses. And I think we've even had examples of that discussion today. So I'm going to break this down in 4 parts. One about the situation and how that arose, and the other parts I'll introduce as I go. One of the most important things, for me at least, is the environmental case, that really when you look at the statistics of established cities, after food waste, which comes and goes, you have this proportion, let's say, this stream of resilient waste, the stuff that doesn't go away. And across Europe, and in fact America and most of the developed world, you can see actually that this is the largest form of waste. And it is representative not just of physical waste, but also carbon, toxicity, effort and value that have been invested in the built fabric and then literally just torn away. The other part of the equation is that we have experienced over especially the last couple of decades, massive shifts in the way that retail, work, lifestyles, industry, etc., has behaved and needed or required space to behave. And so, of course, now we have a situation where lifespans are shortening because of the way we use the internet, because of AI, because of shifts in the way that we behave at work, and COVID is an accelerator for that. So why do we continue building the same type of typologies of building that are already dinosaurs that have a very limited shelf life? And then the question also is, what do we do with cities? This is just one of hundreds of cities where you can see the blue and the yellow, blue being partially and yellow being almost completely vacant. And the vacancy is the chief instigator of demolition, and also the chief instigator of, let's say, urban decay in general. So we have an obligation to be interested as an architectural and an AEC community, engineers, contractors, in the kinds of buildings that are the boring ones, the ones that don't have a heritage protection, that don't have, let's say, a direct or immediate cultural value because they have value in themselves as structures and in the cultural fabric of how they are and how they were used. So what happens when buildings start to become vacant? You get this knock-on effect that they considered to be urban decay. It erodes tax bases, it increases maintenance, and it undermines the vitality of cities. This is what we understand as being a kind of typological risk. It affects whole categories of buildings that were built for a particular purpose. And so the upshot of that is that it's not, say, for example, the structural quality or the way that the building was necessarily treated. It might be a kind of perfect building, but nevertheless, the lifespans of these typologies are disappearing. They're going down. So the question really behind this is, when we're talking about demolition, well, why is new build seen as cheaper than transformation? If you take the innocent point of view, you might say, well, a good quality building, structure is perfect, it's not degraded, it should be, in all essences, cheaper to just turn that into something else than it is to demolish and build new. But we have an interesting history that it has been about 130 years since what you could call the world's first architectural deep fake. And that is the idea that you have a building here, the world's first skyscraper. It was built in Chicago in 1885, and it looks like a building where the facade carries the load, but of course it's not. It's a curtain-walled building that was initiated as a typology. It became extremely, let's say, you could call it viral. It became extremely popular way of building, and it represents the divorce of the architect from the engineer, so that the domain of one being in charge of space and form and the other being in charge of structure parted company in almost the same place in the same time. And of course, very rapidly after that, through the late 80s to the 1930s, you start to get this proliferation of streams by which professionals divided themselves. Now, I guess most of the people in this room know this fact. But the most important aspect of this is that when we consider what we do as practitioners, we as architects, we don't build buildings, we produce media. And this media has its boundary of legal and, let's say, professional parameters. So this media is valuable for the industry. But what it means is that the engineer, the electrical engineer, the fire engineer, the landscape architect, they all have ways of communicating with each other that are somehow parallel, and we have to communicate through these documents that we produce for each other. What that's very good for is producing new buildings. It's very good for creating a single stream of information that goes from top to bottom, but it's not very good when it comes down to the nuances or difficulties of an existing building and how you might deal or transform that. And it's important to understand this framework because since the 1890s, 130 years ago, there have been a whole system of taking our profession in the service of building new and turning it into a global material economy. So materials, finance, insurances, education, it's all wrapped up in being able to use systems that are in essence global. And these global systems have established boundaries that make it very difficult for one to communicate with another fluidly. And the difficulty about transformation or adaptive reuse is that you need this cross-flow of communication because you cannot, every building, you might say, is unique and demands a unique synthesis of professional intervention. So the decision to demolish in terms of, let's say, building owners or portfolio owners is often to demolish before it hits the table of the architect, the engineer, or the contractor. This these decisions tend to happen more and more upstream in the portfolio management side of building decision making. Recently, I would say that there's another nail in the coffin, there's another problem, and that is that it's no longer a good deal to be a developer anymore. It used to be, but now finance is shifting out of the development space and into the equity investment space. This means that very, very large companies that own hundreds or sometimes thousands of buildings are making decisions across their portfolio. And what they're doing is essentially they're commodifying space and architecture. And the goal of commodity economics is to make each product exchangeable with the next in the very same way as gold can be bought, mined, sold anywhere, and it's more or less the same thing. Architecture is continually, or even more now, being treated the same way. So what is valuable for giant equity investors is predictability and the kind of pro forma of an established demand matched with a product. Now that's extremely difficult when it comes down to transformation, because it's the building itself that asked to be, let's say the building itself limits the number of options that you can do with it. The building has its own limitations and parameters that you must honor. So with commodity economics comes commodity production, so it doesn't really matter where you are in the world. Buildings are starting to look the same. I guess this was my point. The idea of interchangeability has become important for the way that money is invested, but it becomes very problematic for transformation of buildings. And therefore, the lifespan of buildings is determined most of the time not because the building is likely to fall down, but because it has reached the end of its market value. So then the question is, what is the future for adaptive reuse? What is the future for transforming existing buildings into a new and viable future? One thing that is really changing the tide, the one thing that is allowing adaptive reuse to become a stronger player, is a simple fact that materials are becoming much more expensive. And we now see that the war in Iran is playing havoc with oil prices, but not just that, material prices as well. Business as usual, of course, is no longer business as usual. It means that if you're an investor and you're planning to build a building in 5 years, you have much less of an understanding of what materials will cost. I'll move back to that in a second, but another part of this is perhaps the understanding that it's not just operational carbon, but embodied carbon as being a primary driver for how decisions and finance is going to be made in future. So the EPBD, this directive of the European Union, it is not now, but it will include whole life carbon analysis, which includes embodied carbon. And suddenly finance and the industry will see the massive shift away from a single focus for performance and into the whole equation of a building, which embodied carbon is I would say the most important, because as energy grids decarbonize, as electricity and heat become less carbon intensive, it's the part of building materials that it's the hard to abate sector. It will demand more carbon than operating a building. So this will become extremely forceful. And the simple point that regardless of what they cost, materials are running out. So there is a black market in sand, and there has been for at least 10 years. Who would have thought that even 30 years ago, when the buildings that we were discussing are being built? And of course, this new term, warflation, is a certain situation where the logistics that we rely on for a global material supply, they're starting to disappear. Suddenly, all of these niche materials that we want from Tibet, from India, from the Middle East, suddenly they're not available anymore. So then, what is the question, or how do you, ourselves, as an architectural practice, work to rectify the educational or the systematic problem that we have with our industry, which is so focused on building new? How do we re-educate ourselves, and how do we re-educate our clients? Well, the first thing is perhaps a design question. It's almost an attitude. And that is, what qualities exist in the building? I'm talking if we talk about these unloved buildings, these B-class or C-class office towers or old malls, isn't there something perhaps more fantastic that we could do as architects than what exists than how it exists as it was built? Maybe we can use our creative qualities to create a future that was better than the intended present. The other part of that is actually the question of business case. Now, the reason why a lot of transformations are not done, and the reason why a lot of demolitions happen, is because at the moment, because we're very badly educated as an industry in general to estimate the cost of transformation, then the margin of error tends to be very wide. And that margin of error, if it looks like it might create a negative profit, as opposed to a very small profit, but a guaranteed profit for new build, an investor will always move to the new build. It's very risk averse. But if we start to look at methods of analysis, not only can we minimize the margin of error, but the interesting thing is that built out of this notion of cost in the first place, we see that transformation, the material value is very low and the labor value is very high, versus it's the opposite with new build, of course. So where you have inflation or material price rises or wars or any of these other factors, the concept of labor is much, much more stable than the concept of material prices. And of course, when we're talking about labor, because we have a 130-year history of optimizing for new build, and we haven't optimized in the same way for transformation, couldn't we use the technologies that we currently have for a more efficient or better planned execution of transformed buildings? So the question is, how do we ask a building what it wants to be? And I would say that what we have been doing, I've been leading a group of researchers and scientists and practitioners that is using AI to look at a building in its current form and run different models of the future by essentially asking the building what it wants to be, testing different variations, and working out how that responds in a financial analysis. So, of course, there are many parts. There's an urban layer. There is the looking at the make or break factors of transformation, such as building code, zoning, certain structural features. I'm sorry, I'll just have to keep going through these. The idea that when you do make a transformation and you change use, then, well, how does daylight affect the profitability of your space? How does views affect it? What can you carve out, or what can you add on that will create a positive business case? And of course, against carbon, what is the relationship between the amount of carbon spent in a transformation versus a new build of the same type? And of course, this is broken down in a sophisticated way, I would say, into different models of finance. So the last bit, and I've got 1 minute to do all of this, I hope for maybe 2 minutes, is the sorts of case studies that I think are very valuable for this discussion. The first one, the Cosmopolitan by Anna Bogdan and partners realized this transformation quite some time ago, nearly 10 years ago now. An amazing renewal of the existing building, and based on the idea that it was a profitability based business case that allowed them to add on an extra layer, to strip things back, and to create a mix of apartments from affordable to market rate that allowed such a building to be produced. It was a very cheap building in a very central location, and we see this over and over if you remember the picture of Chicago. So much real estate is actually in very good locations, and we want to preserve the buildings that can take advantage of that. A similar story with Fortunen, meaning the fortune, and here it was a bank building that was turned over into apartments. One local one from Denmark, Pilman Architects, was interesting because they took the most average building, the most boring building you could think of, on the outskirts of Copenhagen, and they turned it into something spectacular simply by cutting the floors and turning them into staircases, amongst other things. So it was a radical reuse of material that created the identity of the building, not the facade. So the idea that asking what qualities exist can be actually a design approach. Similarly, the Boiler Central, this was one of our projects, and the Spinnery Hall, two spaces that got converted for startups, where you can draw a chalk on the ground, and as tenants grow and shrink, they can be accommodated in the space. And the notion that when we looked at the silos that weren't destroyed because it was literally too difficult to knock it down, how do you allow the structure to create, if you like, a kind of landmark, a way of creating a center for the space from the existing silos, and looking at the idea of the negative, taking one and folding it up to be another. Okay, so I'm nearly out of time. Oh, well, I'm definitely out of time. But this one is an interesting one. It's a library which was failing because the HVAC system, the air conditioning, was not good enough. So instead of demolishing the library and building a new, you just plug the air conditioning in, which had big spaces also for conferences, etc., to make the building come alive again as a modern building. And finally, this one, or second last maybe, this one, the idea that this, one of the world's largest buildings when it was built in Boston, a pier building, had to be transformed by subtraction, not by adding more space, but to create higher quality space by pulling built fabric away so that there could be a different kind of use on the inside. And to extend the perimeter of the boardwalk actually was a very good thing for reintroducing the public to the water's edge. Last one. This has just been opened in Copenhagen, and it's simply the idea that, oops, I'll go back, that was the end. Simply the idea that you can use a transformation as the icon for an area. So this became the magnet for new construction as well, simply because it had the most existing identity to bring forward into a new spatial plan. Now that was the end of my lecture, but I just thought I'd add on to it a little bit more, because I understood actually a couple of days ago that a very important and famous arena in Split is under discussion about being demolished. And this is not a unique situation. So here we have a building, the San Siro Stadium in Milan, a building that is set to be demolished. It's at high risk, and there's an enormous public outcry that is stopping demolition action from happening and forcing the government and the investors to look at keeping and renovating the building. Similarly, the person that brought me to architecture was actually an engineer, Pierluigi Nervi. This building is also this is the Stadio Flamino in Rome. This building is also looking at being demolished. But if you consider what it is about sports stadiums themselves, it's never a question of money, is it? I mean, sports is not a productive industry. It's not like housing where it's a direct social need. It's something that a society pins its identity on. It is a sort of center of culture. And whether you spend 1 million here or 2 million, it doesn't really matter. What matters in this particular project, as far as I can see, is the brilliance of the architecture and the simple fact that, you know, the 206-meter span of this canopy never existed before this stadium was built. This stadium is... At least I got a clap for something, you know. But this stadium is not just a beautiful and well thought out architectural marvel by a brilliant architect, but it is the proof, of course, that Croatia is a leader technically as well as formally. And I think that this is something that you need to hold on to. Because anything in the future that is built that is world-class or dominates the architectural or engineering press in the future will have the shoulders of this to stand on. I think that's the end of my talk. Thank you.